my name is Nic Easley. I'm CEO of 3C Consulting, and today we have a very special Cannabis Unfiltered episode for you where we're going to talk about the cannabis industry and insurance. Something that a lot of operators haven't thought was very important over the years, but as the industry gets more mature and more developed, it's definitely getting much more professional, and insurance is becoming a much more important item than it ever was in the past. Today, I've got two wonderful guests with a plethora of experience in the space, Trevor Pachis and Jessica Walker. They're going to be helping to discuss some of these topics based on some of the industry's hands-on companies and hands-on companies. But Trevor and Jessica, thanks so much for making the time today.
Thank you, Nic, for having us. Nic, I want to say thank you for having us on your podcast today, Cannabis Unfiltered. Recognizing you're an expert in the space, helping thousands of clients reach their business goals. We feel privileged to be associated with you and 3C Consulting.
Absolute honor. We need good vendors and brokers on the insurance side too, and different agents. So definitely is a unique show now. So we're moving this podcast forward to bring in some of the experts in their respective fields because, you know, the industry didn't come from the best beginnings, and it's really all the outside professional organizations that are making this a much more grown-up industry, which the world desperately needs. So yeah, thank you both for making the time and sharing your experience here today too.
Pleasure. Our goal for this session is to help your business owners navigate through the waters of cannabis insurance. The intention is to educate your clients on the most beneficial ways to determine coverage, mitigate loss, and understand how to best protect their investments. Where would you like to begin?
Well, I guess a big one for me, you know, I've got plenty of horror stories from the trenches with clients that didn't have insurance. And when I really think about, you know, there's the cannabis industry, which is this whole new industry, product risk, liability, crop loss, all of these various types of insurance policies that existed for outside industries, farmers, brownie manufacturers, frozen pizza makers, pharmaceutical medicine products or supplements. So I think there's that category. But a big thing that I also see lacking is that many companies don't understand basic business dynamics, where how to have basic business risk insurance like errors and omissions, directors and officers, even on how they do their properties. So, you know, as we get into the specific types of cannabis businesses, dispensaries like retailers, cultivators, manufacturers, transporters, and delivery, what are some of the other insurance policies and features that you think a normal cannabis business needs that's independent from just the cannabis-specific insurance?
Great question. So let's start at, insurance 101. So you're either going to have tenant coverage or you're going to have property owner coverage. So clients either purchase their building or they lease their space. Typically, property must be converted for the designated use. And during this phase, you'll likely need a builder's risk policy. This is a short-term policy which extends coverage during the construction phase. And carriers offer different terms depending on if you're a tenant or the building owner. So maybe we could talk there. Have you seen clients present triple net leases, or what are some of the things most common you're seeing, Nic?
Yeah, absolutely. One major thing to really understand whenever you get into the property and talking about the tenant improvements, the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, there's a big difference, and you really need to understand, first of all, like on a tax side for people, get a good CPA. It's mandatory in the cannabis industry because we have IRC 280E, this really archaic tax provision that is applicable to these controlled substance manufacturers or any company that touches the plant. And each real estate situation is different, but making a property management company that's either going to lease from the original owners if they're not willing to sell it, or that's going to buy that asset, like the raw land, or buy the building and do the improvements. Many times, especially now with the real estate investment trusts, they're making investments into the property management company that does triple net leases, all inclusive. But I think there's a huge difference for operators to understand if they own the building or if they're leasing the building, what sorts of insurance coverage they would need on, let's say, their lights or their CO2 equipment, or while they're building that property, like those sorts of insurance policies that are.
So what we're encouraging owners at that point to do is to think about how much money you're spending for your build out. So if you're a tenant, you're going to want the coverage for the build out costs and for the product that you're going to have at any one time, in your facility. If you're a building owner, then you simply add the additional costs for what it would take to rebuild your structure in the case of a fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely a common thing where I think people get so excited. They win a license, they start to develop the company, and they're like, we need to get into production as quickly as possible. But they really overlook like proper cost accounting for like what's property management, hands-off costs, what's hands-on costs. But then the other parts of, before we get into like the cannabis specific insurance then, because normal insurance industry, you've got your property, your builder's risk, kind of lost. But what about when it comes to like the asset insurance or errors and omission, directors and officers, or general liability insurance? Are there coverage options that you think most companies should really focus on when they're first ramping up the business before they even start operations?
So it depends on the type of business, and it also depends on how you're raising capital. So we could jump into the D&O and talk about that particular coverages.
Well, on the operational side, once we get into that, any sort of company, be it a hands-on company or a hands-off company, licensed cannabis or just a packaging making company or a marketing company providing services for the cannabis industry, always focus on those general kind of coverage for your space, your equipment. And one thing for me, like I own parts of hundreds of cannabis companies and non-cannabis companies through our venture capital funds or through our strategic engagements. And I won't take a board position or an executive position if they don't have directors and officers coverage, because I'm exposing myself to huge liability to be on their board to help them raise capital or win licenses or run the companies. So like that's a big thing. Or when I'm looking at investing into a company, if they don't have errors and omissions or some of the general business insurance, or huge one, I guess that would cover any cannabis company with employees, for example. I know there's a type of policy that we've talked about in the past, Trevor, that kind of helps business owners to protect themselves from their employees and protect their employees as well from like a safety standpoint. But what are some of those additional types of coverage?
Well, first, let's address the D&O coverage, the directors and officers liability. So when you're working to secure funding, investors will likely require you to have a directors and officers policy. D&O insurance ensures that the assets of these individuals are protected against claims while they're acting as a director or officer. The coverage will also extend in the event an investor alleges you've made fraudulent claims in your investment deck, and the D&O policy is for defense costs associated with this type of claim. Suppose for a minute you've raised capital from investors. If something were to go south in the operational success of the company, you couldn't achieve that stated return on the investment deck, investors may sue to reclaim whatever they can from their investment. The D&O policy would protect the directors and officers and their personal assets, and it's also there to protect the company itself with such claims.
Makes perfect sense. So this is all, cannabis industry, federally illegal, full of risk, hence many types of insurance are going to be really important. But this is something that doesn't even have to do with if there was a hailstorm on a crop or if they had, some recalls or a wrongful death type claim. Like this is just normal corporate stuff that makes sense that I've seen hundreds of operators overlook. So it's just one thing I'd invite, our viewers and listeners to look into. If you're in the industry, if you're touching the plant or not, don't just focus on the big sexy cannabis policies of like product risk or crop damage, but really focus on the general business insurance for liability, errors and omissions, directors and officers insurance, tenant insurance, builder's risk insurance. Don't overlook these, when you're looking at the shiny, glittery cannabis company, but make sure you have all those ducks in a row before you even start your operations.
Yeah, great, Nick. And one of the things I think would be important for your viewers who are tuning in is what is the difference between D&O and Eno coverage? So I've spoken a little bit about the D&O coverage. So let's talk about errors and omissions for a moment.
Yeah.
So claims that arise from errors made by employees, independent contractors, or temporary staff. So your staff makes a recommendation on any sort that could lead to an unforeseen mishap that is traced back to faulty advice or negligence. The lawsuit which follows is covered by your errors and omissions policy.
So let's say, for an example, worst case scenario here, errors and omissions might be one really important part of a policy that could be from a multiple claim. Let's say a dispensary bud tender. It's like, this product is going to help you sleep. It's great, high THC, super dank. Someone takes that, maybe they have other pre-existing medical conditions or some sort of, mental instability, mental illness. They go and do something, let's say commit suicide or are driving a vehicle and kill someone. And then they come back and say, this bud tender told me this product was going to work for this. It didn't. It caused all of this. So it's the bud tender's fault. It's the company's fault. It's the product's fault. Are there various coverage options that would maybe apply in that instance, Trevor?
So again, this is where having a broker who understands the industry well can keep you out of hot water and protect your investment in situations like that. So my answer directly to your question would be errors of admission would be one of the areas in which that would be protected, and also product liability. I think this might be a good opportunity, Nick, at this point to discuss the difference between general liability and product liability.
I think so. And just as a side note, just like you said, working with a broker that understands the industry, this is complex stuff, everybody. And if you do this sort of thing wrong and you have a claim and it's not covered, you might be facing $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, like a life-changing bankruptcy type situation. And some of that you might not be able to get out of. And there could even be potentially like criminal liability. The cannabis industry, as it's grown, lawyers, accountants, all these other groups have just jumped into it because it's a new massive revenue stream. But there's a lot of insurance companies that have popped up overnight that don't understand the industry, have provided really bad coverage. So make sure, reach out to someone like Trevor, like Jessica, which will get you their contact information, but a broker that knows the industry that can help you navigate these questions before you're in the frying pan.
Yeah, it's great advice. And what I would encourage, different than other business policies, what you really want to focus on when you get your proposals is what are the exclusions? And that will help you to understand. And if you don't get it, it doesn't make sense. Ask before something happens.
So like those, 20 to 50, 100 pages of insurance policies, they should probably look at that, have their lawyer look at that, or work with a broker and go through those line by line to understand what's covered or not. I mean, with current situation with pandemic, which I'm sure we're going to discuss with some of these coverage options, I had a lot of clients just think, oh, we're going to be covered for business interruption or, for pandemic response or the costs we need to do to change all of our operations. Simply wasn't the case once most people looked actually at their insurance policies and those exclusions.
And hence, again, the plug for the broker. That's where your broker should come in. They should advise on what is, and more importantly, I would say, what is not covered.
So what are some instances of policies when it comes to, let's say, product liability or these other cannabis specific kind of insurance options? And I'm sure there's some exclusions on the Eno and Dnl, if it's blatant fraud or something like that. Some of those things aren't covered, or force majeure, act of God. What are some of those kind of things that are excluded in common policies people need to be aware of?
Good question. So let me back it up just a minute and explain the difference between general liability and product liability, because this is an area where you definitely should consider picking up coverages. So a building and contents coverage, general and product liability, and also business interruption, along with other coverages such as crime, EPLI, and even equipment breakdown, are the coverages that you should consider kind of as a baseline, depending on what industry you're in. But those transfer over from industry to industry. I think it's important here to talk about the difference now between product liability and general liability. So if you think for a moment, general liability is intended for bodily injury caused by your operation, your staff. So think of the slips, trips, and falls. Whereas product liability protects you from damage resulting from the goods your business sells: flour, edibles, accessories. And this might be a good time for Jessica to give us an example of a claim that we've experienced as it relates to product liability. Jessica?
Yeah, so thank you guys both so much. So a good claim example, or one that we've come across that we do see sometimes, and it's really not one you think of, but people bring the products home, whether it be edibles or things like that, and some of them do look like candy. And so we've had situations where, children have gotten into their parents' stash and become very ill from those, and then the dispensary is sued and the carrier defends those. So that's a really good example of product liability and like the misintended use. Because the one thing with product liability that is really important kind of in a general term is that any product you put out in the marketplace has a possibility of a claim being attached to it, whether it be a product defect or misintended use of that product. And even though product liability is not required in every state, it's a very important coverage to look into because it helps you with those scenarios. Because, misintended use, we never know when that's going to happen.
So Jessica, just to add to that, would you say that product liability is a large percentage of losses that we see or a small percentage of losses that we see?
Yeah, Trevor, it's definitely a large percent of losses that we see because the majority of any of these industries, they make their revenue based off of selling those products. So most of their claim risk is the product that they have out in the marketplace.
Now, Nic, have you had any experience with clients that you're working with that didn't have product liability? And maybe you could share an example of what not to do?
Well, it's always, as a human species, it's most important to know what not to do to determine what to do and, never repeating mistake of the past. And that's one of the great things with our experience. We've had to commonly dive in a triage situation whenever we can start designing something correct from the start, like win license, good CPAs, good lawyers, good consultants on the compliance side, good brokers on the insurance side, really plan it out from capital raise forward, way less instances. Here in Colorado, I had a client a couple years ago, no names here and, just growing pains of the industry, but they had a major deficit where they were doing great orders, making edibles, but they ran out of packaging and had all these back orders. So they just kept making products, making these brownies, making these cookies, making these edibles. And this was in February, kind of like why I have a fire here. Colorado can be cold sometimes, not normally in early September, with our foot snowstorm that happened. But this packaging showed up that was on a FedEx truck that had just driven across Nebraska in the winter on the interstate. This packaging was probably negative 20 degrees. They brought it inside, didn't have policies and procedures for how to actually get packaging to room temperature. They had orders. They needed to make cash flow. They needed to actually sell these things quickly. So they just started opening those packages, putting in these brownies that were 70 degrees. They closed it. You got a delta T, a difference in temperature of 90 degrees there, caused a condensation point. A lot of these products had mold and then were failing tests on that, but they were selling them. And then for the returns on these, people were saying they were getting sick from eating these moldy brownies. And then people that maybe had moldy ones or not, all were joining forward saying hey, I got sick or I could have gotten sick from this too. And just like anyone that's, been at a hotel late night and not been able to sleep and watching TV, it's did you work in this asbestos mine 52 years ago? If so, you might be entitled to compensation. Those sorts of claims are going to be coming more, but they were facing massive lawsuits, class action lawsuits from consumers. They didn't have any coverage whatsoever, and they had everything that they had to do is these settlements and paying the legal fees out of pocket. Because even normally, like an errors and omissions policy, that'd probably cover, a policy that's $200, $300, $400 a year. That might cover up to $1 million of not only the damages or the lawsuit claim, but also paying those lawyers to defend the claim and deal with that. That's something that hits these companies. And it hit that company when they went to their lawyer and were like, hey, we have this problem that's happening. And they're like, okay, you need to let your insurance provider know. And they're like, what insurance provider? And that's when the lawyer realized this is all going to be out of pocket for the actual client to actually pay those fees. And he's like, this is going to get really expensive really quick. We just need to go on a settlement route instantaneously. Because even if you buy an insurance policy after you crash your car, they're probably going to look into that. I mean, insurance fraud's nothing new in this world, I'm sure, as you both have seen. But in that instance, it cost that company almost $2 million in settlements, losses, and it hurt their brand, probably $20, $30 million that they could have gotten ahead of that, if they had had this type of coverage.
Nic, too, a good thing to make sure that people really know as well, with general liability and product liability, people automatically assume that if you have general liability, product liability is a piece of that. But with some carriers, that is the case, but it's a good thing to also know that sometimes those are separate policies. And that's where the whole, making sure you're looking at your exclusions and things is a really good idea to talk to your agent about.
Yet another reason, use a broker or an insurance agent that knows what they're doing, that has, that's bona fide, been in the space and has the experience. The new insurance people, they see a whole new category that they could insure. But kind of on the history of this, I remember, 10 years here in Colorado, there was no sorts of insurance available. Cash, there wasn't insurance. Lloyd's of London was in, Lloyd's was out. It's definitely been an evolution, but would you say that you're seeing more and more coverage options available for cannabis companies now?
I think what I would say, and if I could take that, Jessica, is the more demand there is, the more that the carriers are going to figure out solutions. But as you think about product liability, that coverage is specifically designed for, product contamination, bodily injury damages that, that come from there. Also, you could find fines and penalties for non-compliance with state regulations. So there's a number of things that have been added to additional endorsements to product liability because of the demand in the marketplace. So absolutely, Nick, it continues to evolve. And because most carriers are in the E&S markets, these can change they change much more quickly than they would be if they're US based.
And so just as a clarifier, military crypto linguist kind of vet here. I love acronyms, but I think some of our listeners might not be. So you said before like EDIL, I believe, and then the ES you just went over. Could you just define and kind of state what those are?
Sure. So Jessica, talking about EPLI, I think that was your question, Nick. So EPLI is a specified coverage within a business. Jessica, can you go through that a little bit and give us some descriptions and details?
Yeah, for sure. So with EPLI, or employment practices liability, it is a coverage that's often overlooked, but it's a super important coverage really for any business, but in the cannabis realm as well. So really what it is it's a coverage designed to protect an owner or a manager from any accusations from an employee of wrongful termination, discrimination, harassment. So that is a really super important coverage for any business, but like I said, it's often overlooked.
So that would be one your general liability, errors and omissions, directors and officers, like the builder's risk insurance, or tenant insurance if you're renting, or property insurance if you're buying. That should be up there on the mandatory list then.
Correct.
Absolutely.
One example of that, just kind of talking dispensaries, California client of mine, they fired a staff member for on camera stealing from the till in a dispensary, stealing money, pocket. Security side saw that, they watched more. It happened a few times. They brought that person aside, had called the police, fired that person. About a week later, there was a wrongful termination lawsuit for her being a minority, of different type of gender. And so wrongful termination. The claim was made, even though on camera, stealing money, putting it in pocket, that's why they were fired. But it cost the company probably $150,000 to defend in settlements and the other things, because it would have cost a lot more to even go forward with all those steps, and you get ambulance chaser type lawyers. But that was a good company. It cost them probably $250,000 from not having that sort of insurance.
And that's specifically what EPLI coverage is designed for, Nick.
Gosh, it makes sense.
To add to that, Trevor, that's where as well, where you're talking, you're watching the video of them taking money right out of the register. So theft is, roughly 60% of theft claims come from inside of the business, exactly like you're talking about. And another really big coverage to look at is crime coverage. So crime coverage is specifically designed for any type of employee theft. So whether an employee, takes money from the till, like you're saying, or somehow takes it from a client directly, and or crime coverage also fits in there too for if an employee unknowingly accepts bad checks or counterfeit money and things that way. So there is a coverage separately, specifically designed for that.
So business is risky, any sort of business. You're mowing lawns, you're building buildings, you're selling hot dogs, or anything in the cannabis industry. Lots of risk. Whenever there's this sort of risk, to protect yourself as the business owner, protect your shareholders, protect your staff, protect your clients, by having good products, good quality assurance procedures within that, and good insurance. It just seems mandatory. So, I mean, I've got horror stories for days and weeks when it comes to companies that were growing and evolving with this. But if we were to kind of switch here and think, if we're looking at dispensaries specifically, you've got a retail location, they have to store product, they have cash, ID verification, all of the various kind of provisions. But what would be some additional types of insurance, maybe specific to a dispensary owner, medical or recreationally, that they should consider as well?
So the other coverage outside of general liability, product liability, crime, the EPLI. The last one that I would mention specifically here is also business interruption.
Oh, okay. I mean, business interruption, like a key man or a key woman, gets hurt, the power goes out for 9 days and they can't make sales. Or what about this pandemic? Like, how much coverage was there? Or from like the riots, like where they got broken into, was that like act of God? Or what are some of those things that you've seen in these current times with coronavirus?
Yeah, so Nick, we get this question all the time. Business interruption, think of it as business income. So in order for the coverage to apply, something physically needs to happen to the facility. There needs to be damage to property. There needs to be damage to your product, your contents. And think of a fire. The most common example is a fire in your facility. So when you're shut down because of the fire and you're losing income, then in most instances, business interruption or business income will apply. Or however, if you're shut down without damage to your building or contents, then business income will likely not apply. Now, as we address COVID and the pandemic, different from riots and civil unrest, in most instances, COVID is a specific exclusion on business policies. And that's universal across all businesses. So it's not specific to cannabis, but again, COVID and pandemic are typically exclusions on all business policies.
It sounds like some business owner in your background's about to need to call their insurance broker because something's happening there. Somebody's on fire, somebody's getting robbed. Yeah, something's happening. Well, the more we talk about this, the more it makes me, I kind of get a little scared. I own parts of a lot of these companies. I've been in the game for over a decade, but I'm learning some new things on this where I'm like, I know we have most of those for this company, or that company is going to be doing that when they get to their next round. But it's really something that business owners need to consider no matter what type of business you're in. If you're in business, even outside of the cannabis industry, there's risk. You fire an employee for stealing a ladder, they might sue you, for, wrongful termination. That could literally close your business down, especially like smaller business owners. And there's always I'm, small kid from like rural Wisconsin. I'm all about protecting the little guys, the little girls. Like we got to protect, if you've ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, we got to protect the workers from the man. The man can sometimes do horrible things. We need to allow like unionization, safe working practices for our workers. But there's also, as a business owner, when I put on that hat, we have to protect the business from the employees or from, all those ambulance chasers that are just trying to get at the business because they see you as a cannabis person, you got tons of money. They're going to come at you from lots of different angles. I've seen, a woman come in and intentionally slip in a dispensary and sue a lawsuit the next day with a claim that looked like it would have taken a month to draft. So that you got to the CYA, cover your ass, all aspects of the business. So on a dispensary side, dispensaries not making products, like they're not making brownies or growing the flower. Is there a different type of risk they have for just being a reseller of a product compared to someone who's actually manufacturing and making those products?
Yeah, so there sure are. And the thing that I want to build on, Nick, what you're commenting there is, I can make you insurance more. I definitely have the ability to add coverages beyond, the scope of where you need to be. But if you really think about it, you need to find someone who's going to educate you on what coverages are available, what they mean, and then you apply that knowledge and experience to deciding if spending your money on that coverage is worth it. And this way, what is and is not coverage, so you're in control of your cost, and you're in control of your risk tolerance. And I think that's the best advice that I can give those out there with established businesses that are new to the industry is find a broker you can trust, find someone who can educate you on what coverages are out there and available and what your exposures are. By doing so, it puts you in a position of knowledge and then allows you the ability to decide where you spend your money.
Yeah, it's so critical now when I budget out these new companies, like going for applications or when we're reviewing companies' investment kind of performance and financial models and decks to see if it's like worthy of investment, I always look at those operational expenditure kind of budgets. Like what's your policies going to cost to get started? What are those monthly? And then on a 5-year basis, like let's say those policies go up in price, 3% a year, like have they calculated that increase? But commonly for these cannabis companies, depending on size and scope, just to kind of throw some numbers out, for a dispensary, for general type business insurance, all of the product risks, I'll normally have about $150,000 annual budget for insurance. Now, like manufacturing, especially as volume goes up, coverage amounts are going to go up, price is going to go up, same thing for cultivators. But usually I'm looking anywhere between 100, 150K annual as a budget, as a placeholder for all of these types of insurance. Now, I'm sure, as an underwriter or dealing with brokers and agents, Trevor and Jessica, you've seen like sometimes that might be higher or lower, but what would you say are some good placeholder budgets for like a cultivator, a manufacturer, dispensary to like have while they're like planning out their companies?
So I think the way that I would prefer to answer that would be is many brokers can give you an indication. So because the costs are different from California all the way across to New York, it would be real difficult to put a figure on it. And know that most of your expenses are driven from revenue. So if you're projecting 2 million in revenue versus 200,000, it's going to make a substantial difference in the cost of your insurance. And then all these line items that we just went through, EPLI, how many employees do you have? When you're talking about product liability, how much product are you selling? When you're talking about tenant or coverage for your facility, do you have a 20,000 square foot facility or do you have a 10,000 square foot facility? So I think the best way to serve and to answer that would be find a broker you can trust, someone who can give you an indication as it relates specifically to your type of risk.
And
Now, there are other coverages, Nick, that you might want to consider when you're looking at manufacturing and processing facilities as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know like we've had to work on indications in the past when they're a requirement, but just for our listeners and viewers here, what's the difference between an insurance indication and an insurance quote? And then what's the timeline or steps to actually get a policy? Like what things would you need as a broker to like best guide a client on what sort of policies they need and what's the timelines on those things?
Sure. So an indication is very similar to a quote. An indication is where I would sit down with a client, gather up, maybe give me an hour, gather up the information about your potential business, what it looks like, allow me to interview you. Then we take that information and I deliver it back to Jessica. We have a number of carriers that we're working with. We then market your business to those particular carriers. And Jessica, can you even comment on how long it takes to get a return quote back?
Yeah, so when you're looking at those quote times, it's really going to depend, like you were saying, Nick, on the size of the business, and Trevor, you were saying that as well. Because obviously, if you're looking at like a grow facility, that brings in 25 million a year and has 4 different locations, we're looking and taking all of that into consideration versus just looking at maybe like one dispensary or one storefront. But yeah, I would say, the average on those, some of those very well you can get within a week. And sometimes it extends a little farther. We just really want to make sure that we're helping you and taking a look at your specific business and your loss control and the things that are best for you and working with Trevor on getting those best coverages placed.
Yeah, it makes sense. So start early on these things. Don't just call an insurance broker once you've had an accident or some sort of error. But if you win a license within that first month of like post-application win, you pop the champagne, you recover from the hangover the next day, lawyers, consultants, CPAs, and insurance brokers and agents. Like that seems like the most important call. It's not what nutrient are we going to use to grow which light, like what kind of packaging, how should our logo look? Like some of those things, they are important, but like urgent versus important, these are the urgent cover your ass things that if you don't do them, I've seen hundreds of companies go out of business, even in the cannabis industry where we're selling a commodity that's sometimes more valuable than gold because they didn't do these things right. So now like kind of moving forward like into manufacturing, like you're making a product, you're using extraction. Maybe you've got volatile solvents, class 1, div 1, like 200 gallons of ethanol sitting there, employees making like certain edibles or products. Are there different coverages that they would need to consider as a manufacturer or an extractor compared to like, let's say a dispensary or a cultivator?
Yeah, so in addition to the coverages we mentioned before, you also want to consider product recall and also equipment breakdown. Jessica, product recall, different than product liability. I know you've gone through a couple of claim situations there. Can you give us a good one on product recall?
Yeah, so when you, Trevor, when you're really looking at product recall, you kind of want to think of it as like the backside of product liability. So a good example of like we have seen of that is a manufacturer sold a batch of edibles to probably like 20 different dispensaries in the area. A consumer bought the edible, had an allergic reaction, and ended up in the hospital. After that, they turn around and sued the dispensary because, right, everybody gets pulled into litigation at that point until they figure out, who is responsible. And it was found that the manufacturer ended up responsible because one of the ingredients, the one specifically that customer was allergic to, was unintentionally omitted from the label. So at that point where product recall came in was that dispensary then, that manufacturer has to then go back to all 20 dispensaries they sold that batch to and get all of that product back. So you have the loss of revenue, right, because you sold it to them. Now you have the cost of pulling that product back, and then you have the cost of destroying that product to whatever your state regulations are. So that's where like product recall can be a really key piece in that.
Oh, that's huge. I mean, and good lesson here. Like, don't use things that are common allergens. Label your products correctly. Try your best to not make child appearing things. Like granted, they used to make like kids cigarettes. That's not a good thing. But like in cannabis, we have to be beyond reproach professionally. So looking at those sorts of the processes to make sure that's not going to happen, because the most expensive thing I hear then from this is the brand damage too. And in Colorado, when we really started in 2014, 15, really pushing hard on like pesticide testing and others, companies that would get hit with this, like their revenues, loss of income thinking here could go down, by 90%. Like once people knew about like, let's say like Rocky Mountain Suckers and some of those companies, or like when Organogram in Canada had some of those big recalls, people don't want to buy that product. So you got to kind of cover your ass in the first part if that were to happen, but also have processes and procedures in place to avoid those things where you would have a claim in the future. But let's say it was with that company that had a recall, would maybe a business interruption insurance, be able to help with something like that potentially too?
So business interruption is not designed for that type of scenario. Again, it has to do with the direct physical loss to the building, where the advertising and recovery from that is something a number of carriers are considering and looking into. But again, it's a very difficult coverage to place at this time.
So we're getting more options. I mean, yeah, because 10 years ago, we didn't have any options at all. Now when I'm thinking even about like, if we think manufacturing, you've got like the product recalls, product loss, liability, all the other general business insurance that we had talked about before, Eno, Dnl, EDIL, all of, those wonderful acronyms that you need a good agent to help you navigate. Now let's think about cultivators. I know there's, from coming from farm country as a kid, like some years there would be major things. Or last week here in Colorado, 3 days ago in Colorado, I got a foot of snow here at 9,000 feet, 3 weeks earlier than we've ever seen snow. And then you've got all these fires going on right now in California, Colorado, Oregon, hundreds of millions of dollars of crop loss. So when we think about cultivators, you've got indoor, you've got greenhouse, you've got outdoor, lots of different types of coverage. But what are some other things that maybe cultivators should consider looking into for coverage types? And what are then some things that would be normal to normal ag that cannabis cultivators don't have the privilege or ability to obtain at this point?
Well, as you know, Nick, plants have a set value and based on the maturity. So the most important component here is making sure you purchase coverage for the most product you will have at one time. So the coverage extends from seed all the way through harvest. So unplanted, ungerminated seeds, clones, vegetative plants, flowering plants, harvested plants, mother plants, etc. So when you're purchasing insurance, you want to take all of that into consideration in addition to making sure you insure your grow equipment. So this is for an indoor facility. When it comes to outdoor facilities, crop insurance, again, very, very difficult to place. We're finding that most situations don't warrant the cost, whereas the insurance carriers today, they want and they can control those indoor grow facilities.
Well, just had a question. Like, I work with everything from small scale to some of the largest projects on earth for cannabis cultivation, huge outdoor, greenhouse, indoor. I do indoor when we have to, but greenhouse just on a cost standpoint. But would you say, like when I'm talking greenhouse, this is 4-season hybrid greenhouse. I'm not talking about hoop houses with flimsy plastic, but glass or steel walls, fully enclosed, 4 walls and a roof, meet the definition of an indoor facility, but allow natural sunlight to come through polycarbonate or glass. Are most greenhouses considered in an insurance realm indoor or kind of like an outdoor?
They definitely are considered indoor. When they're built to those specifications that you were just talking about, when you're looking at a plant or if there's loft that way, those are covered. Now, when you're talking more of like the hoop houses and things like that, they specifically have a few more, issues with giving some coverages on that. But really, when we're talking indoor versus outdoor, if it's in a building, you definitely can look more at having that product coverage or that plant coverage versus if you're looking at a full outdoor crop.
Super. Really good, important definition there, because these, even spending $100 a square foot or more on these hybrid type greenhouses or Venlo greenhouses, it's an indoor crop. It would qualify for those coverages and be so needed. Like, even like you said, Trevor, from like the seeds, how many clones, how many stock plant, mother plants, maturity of those plants, and then knowing and understanding your plants. This is something I'm sure you would have to deal with, like with your brokers, and you've probably got experience, Trevor and Jessica, of if you're growing 1 plant per light or a very big plant, it might be doing, 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds of yield. You'd want to make sure you capture that in your indications versus just like, 1 plant's worth $30 or $50 or $250.
Very true. Very true there.
So what, like from an outdoor standpoint, the big things that I've seen, this year I've got a couple friends that lost huge fields. With this really wet early snow, 8-foot plants one day, on the ground the next day. And cannabis is fine with cold temperatures, like down to about 25, 24 degrees. That's when it's your terminal. But what are some other things, like let's say insect damage, or if there was like a fungal infection, a big hailstorm for an outdoor crop? Are there certain things that are more beneficial in insurance coverage, it sounds like, to do indoor greenhouse compared to do outdoor?
Yeah, so obviously you can control more of those situations by having indoor versus outdoor. The things that you're going to want to look for is the ability for the carrier to possibly send out a loss control team. So these teams come out and they can help assist in making sure that there's correct distance between the plants and the lighting. They can help assist with the separation and recommendations of how you store chemicals and fertilizers. And this partnership with your carrier, because they don't want you to have a loss either. Right. But that partnership is a valuable component of choosing and assessing your risk and making sure that you're in the right spot and doing the right things to protect your investments.
Makes perfect sense. I think on these big ones, thinking about crop insurance or product, like what if that product were like, if there was a fire, if there was like a massive theft and they stole all this. And, I think most of us know most theft in the cannabis industry comes from internal. We do see external, threats, and during coronavirus and some of the riots out, what I saw with clients in Illinois with their dispensaries being robbed, or out in Berkeley. One got robbed 3 times, then finally burned down. It was like, those poor ones, but like they lacked on having some proper coverage here. When we think about where, I'm not going to want to rob a bank. Like they expect that. But like, what about when that armored car is moving from like picking up all the money to the bank? It seems like transport's an area I want to really get into because, in key definitions here, just for everyone that's listening and watching here today, there's a big difference between delivery, distribution, transportation. Transportation and distribution licenses, that's to move product from like a cultivation facility to a dispensary or to a lab, B2B, like business to business. Delivery, which has been exploding with the help of coronavirus, one of the silver clouds of coronavirus here, is like from the dispensary to someone's house or where they actually order that, which has been allowed and approved in many, many more states and is taking massive new market share. So are there different coverage kind of options that if you're a transporter or a delivery distribution company, you want to consider compared to being a delivery company and having people drive like, pizzas from Domino's compared to moving like all the tomatoes from one place to another?
Yeah, there definitely is, Nick. And this is a very challenging component of the business for the insurance carriers. It's just not profitable. So let's talk about some of the definitions to start. Property in transit, that means you're transporting your product to your product facilities. Cargo means you're transporting somebody else's product from facility to facility. And by default, products are not covered during the transportation process defined as cargo. So it's something you want to make sure you're speaking with your broker about. The other component you brought up, Nick, is the delivery services. So in almost all instances, delivery is excluded from the insurance policies. You want to make sure you're talking with your brokers to understand if what's called hired and non-owned auto is available. Hired and non-owned auto means hired, I've hired an employee and now they're delivering product. Non-owned, is the delivery of the product by the employee. The hired is I go out and I rent a truck and then I go do these deliveries. So in almost all instances, the product's not going to be covered during that delivery process today. And what I would encourage your listeners to make sure of is the liability coverage. Is my employee using their car, if they get into an accident and someone dies, will my policy extend to that particular situation? And that's really important. And when you don't know, make sure you ask.
Ignorance is not a good excuse, apparently, when it comes to insurance audits and claims. Definitely makes sense. Well, I see a huge opportunity here. We're fully anticipating delivery, even post-coronavirus, to take 20-25% of the market share, in the future. Kind of like Uber Eats, Grubhub, like these things, like they sound new at first. It's like no one will ever buy food through an app. And then you're like, I bought a bathtub on Amazon last week. You used to buy books on Amazon. Like things change and we need to evolve with it. And I think this is a huge opportunity for insurance providers to look at as there's more and more of these delivery opportunities in states allowing these licenses. Even I had this with a California company that was transitioning to allow drive-through. It was like, that's something we need to talk about with our broker because this is the transaction's now happening, from a vehicle to the store and not inside the store, which was required. And we found out if we were actually doing those sales without, changing our policy a little bit, nothing would have been covered there. So as the industry changes and evolves and as your business evolves, make sure to keep your broker, just like your lawyers, your CPAs, your consultants and advisors, keep them all up to speed on the changes of your business. Because if something changes, you don't alert them, you might not be covered. And knowledge is really power in these instances because it's a dirty, risky world out there. And like you said, and how I think with investment risk, like what's my tolerance on this specific investment? When you're looking at bringing in larger investors and you're scaling this company, doing multiple millions in revenue a year and getting bigger, if you're thinking about doing a merger and acquisition, that other company, if they have insurance and you don't, you've got skeletons in the closet that might come out and bite you in the ass. Like they're going to look at that. You might not be as attractive on a merger standpoint or an acquisition or even, not the Canadian side, God help you, but like potential IPOs for initial public offerings. You got some risk here. You got exposure. No matter what sort of business you're in, be it cannabis, be it the packaging or marketing side, there's always exposure. So understanding your risk, how do you cover your downside, cover your risk mitigation, and of course, you don't know about this shit as much as like someone like Trevor or Jessica with their experience and years in the industry. Same thing, like if there's new people coming in, like be humble, look for these advisors, look for these agents. Like they want to sell you good policies that are going to work for you and be there for you. Like, like a good neighbor or not. But one thing I liked what you said, Trevor, early on there was not like progressive flow lady there, but you're shopping around. If you compared to, let's say, a different type of broker or agent, they only have one provider. Like you have the ability of going to multiple providers to say, okay, this type of insurance for you would be X amount for this sort of coverage with these different providers. Maybe you should go for this one because there's better coverage or it's less expensive. I mean, it sounds like you've got a variety of options you can broker this to.
Yeah, and we can also piecemeal and put it together, choosing the best terms and pricing from the different carriers. And Nic, one question that I'm often asked is, how do you get better pricing? How do you get more favorable terms? And one of the most important components of your application for insurance should include the resumes of the owners, the managers, the employees. By providing their education, background, and work experience, it's going to assist the carrier in understanding why you're a better risk. So if you're a dispensary, do you have experience in working in retail, managing restaurants, or do you own a dispensary already? Within manufacturing, do you have prior work experience in food service or the health and beauty industries? In oil extraction, where insurance is quite difficult to place, what prior experience do you have with extraction? And Jessica, I know you've got some experience here and you've been through a number of quotes as it relates to oil extraction. Do you have some advice?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So when you're looking at oil extraction, these are what we really want to look at is what kind of experience. So like you're saying, the resume is a huge thing here, whether you have experience or your operating, your main operator has experience on whether it be like doing other kinds of oil. Because, right, we know cannabis is new in some states and insurance companies are aware of that. So people are just getting into things. But, have you done olive oil or grapeseed oil or, do you have an agricultural background in some of these things? And what are you using to extract the oils? And, what we will do a lot of times, like Trevor was saying prior, is we will send a loss control team out or an inspector out just to double check everything for your safety and your business and, for loss control purposes on that end too, because obviously loss control can help regulate insurance premiums in years to come and things that way. So those are kind of a lot of the I's and T's that we look over when we're looking at an oil extractor.
Yeah, Nic, as you're looking at the growing facilities, is there a botanist or a horticulturalist on staff? Share the details of their work experience, any farming experience. And then lastly, how does your education apply to the business? And why does that make you a better risk to the carrier? And as a broker, our role is to guide you and assist you in putting these together and then presenting your risk to the carriers. And these steps are crucial in obtaining the best coverage for the best price. And this is what you should expect from your broker to keep you informed on coverage enhancements that are also entering the market. So this is what we do well at Pachis Associates.
That's just awesome. I've learned so much, on this one. And even though like I said, I've got lots and lots of companies in the space, lots have different coverage. I'm sure now I'm like actually going to have a lot more of them give you a call. The insurance, it's something that's big, and I'm seeing some parallels here when it comes to the insurance and the investment side. But when many of the new states, when we're applying for new licenses or countries, showing that experience, like the team's knowledge, the team's experience, or that they have licenses in other jurisdictions, that always helps push them across the line compared to a new team that's like wants to get into cannabis or somebody's cousin grew some weed in their basement. It's very, very different. And when I'm looking at companies to invest into, I'm always looking at their management team. And sometimes people just build their team with like this person that's an advisor or not, but really think about how building your team with like knowledge, experience in applicable outside industries, be it business, finance, agriculture, pharmaceutical, manufacturing, retail, delivery, any of those aspects, build your team because it's only going to help you to win your license, run your company, get cheaper and better insurance, as well as potentially garnish the investment that's the lifeblood of your company. But yeah, I've learned so much on this one night. It just makes me feel like I hate when I see clients on the consulting side go in on this stuff alone and try to navigate stuff that we've done hundreds of times and could do for them very quickly and easily and better than they could do. The same thing, I think, working with a firm like yours, Trevor, working with Jessica, trying to figure out what are the best policy options available for your business. As the business changes, how to work together with that. As the industry changes, your license type changes, your revenues change. I'm sure it's a different insurance kind of coverage on 2 million in revenue versus 10 million. And things get bigger and you have a big loss. I'm sure if you didn't update your broker and your policy, it might not actually cover those additional kind of revenues. So now more than ever, understanding your business, the efficiencies, coronavirus has changed everything. The world's gotten a lot riskier, but in doing so, we can kind of cover that risk through better insurance options. And I'm just really excited to learn more on this. And no matter what the business, if you're a grower, a small micro business in Michigan compared to a dispensary in Massachusetts, a CBD products manufacturer that's shipping things across state lines, this isn't just the property and the hands-off side for cannabis and then the hands-on cannabis licenses, but CBD hemp industry equally has a lot of insurance needs that haven't been met because people haven't realized there are insurance options out there.
Agreed.
Well, kind of as we move towards closing, any kind of closing remarks that you have, Trevor or Jessica, are the most important thing you want our listeners to remember about cannabis and the insurance and maybe the pitfalls of making sure to get some good proper coverage?
Well, the one thing I'd say, first of all, is thank you for the opportunity to speak with your listeners, those that are tuning in. Find someone you can trust. Find someone that has the knowledge base, that has the team, that has the ability to reach out, and someone who is also going to say, you know what, Nic, that's not going to be covered. That's not an option. At least then and you can mitigate that potential situation because you're not going to have insurance for it.
Right.
By partnering up with someone that you have someone that has experience, someone that you can trust, that's where I think is the most important component of deciding on who you're going to work with, picking up that education, and that's where the most value is going to come in.
Yeah.
Agreed. And again, thank you, Nic, as well, for the opportunity to be a part of the podcast. And I 100% agree with Trevor. That relationship and just trusting, your agent or broker is the most important thing.
Yeah, now more than ever, I think insurance has been a big thing where people they didn't think they had options available, but we are a bona fide industry. There are institutions involved in this, not so much institutional capital, providing capital, but even allowing, the 800 plus banks and credit unions that do banking services for the cannabis industry, the insurance options now available. Today we've definitely gone through a few reasons why you want to make sure to get into insurance and not just, protecting your brownie, but protecting every aspect of the business that you can. And there are some aspects, as we learned today, that won't be covered, like outdoor crop insurance, really, really challenging, maybe not worth the price of the premiums, but that Eno, Dnl insurance, the goods in transit, there's so many types of insurance people need to look into. And just since some people might be listening, if people were to need to get in touch with you, Trevor and Jessica, maybe you want to just state your email address or where they could find you or a phone contact just in case they're listening in.
So I'll take the lead on this. Our office is 847-905-1905. We're based out of Evanston, Illinois. And my email address is T as in Trevor, Pachis @amfam.com.
AmFam. We've been waiting for the big ones to kind of get in here, knowing that some of those are providing options, quotes, indications. It's making me feel a lot more bona fide as an industry provider here. And like I said, I'm just so excited to get some experts that have the insurance space here on the line with Cannabis Unfiltered. It's something I've seen too many people, no pun intended, get burned on over the years, not having proper insurances. Great growers, manufacturers, dispensaries go out of business because they didn't understand how to cover their ass. And there's a lot of risky business in a new emerging industry. Lots can happen, but just when people see you in cannabis, they see dollar signs and they want to come at you, be it employees, be it others from theft, be it vendors, be be it the lady that walks in and intentionally slips in your floor. You got to make sure to cover yourself because you're building your dreams. You're providing medicine to people who need it. Like, this matters. And if you're a good operator, it's not just your responsibility to do this well to your shareholders, but it's the opportunity to be a good provider in the industry, to represent this industry well as it grows. Like, by having good social equity, minority-owned businesses, like, I'd hate to see them get screwed over by not having some good insurance. And here they could have been a great operator that's like a great lead example that motivates other people to get into the space. Also, like, undoing the wrongs of the drug war, but they didn't have the sort of insurance. An employee sued them. They can't cover the lawsuit side and they go bankrupt. And remember, friends, bankruptcy protection is a federal thing. This is a state-by-state cannabis program, and federal bankruptcy protections do not apply to you. So don't just count on being able to get out if, like, oh, screw the insurance, we'll just risk it, have a big problem, and, like, we'll just go bankrupt. Those losses are going to follow you. So yeah, this has been a really insightful show. Again, my name's Nic Easley, CEO of 3C Consulting, Managing Director of Multiverse Capital. Really was an honor to have Trevor and Jessica on the line to talk about insurance today, how to cover your ass. And please, if you're in the industry, reach out to these sorts of brokers, get some good experts, understand this, because you might be the best grower in the world. I guarantee you don't know shit about proper insurance coverage and what might be excluded and not. Like, make sure to magnify your greatness by using some of these other experts' greatness to make sure your company stays in business for the long term. Until this gets federally legal, it's on us to do this right and act as professional and normal as possible, even in the coronavirus times, because you never know when an unexpected fire just might take everything out, or a wrong slip, or a bad storm, or a tornado, you name it. Things can happen. It's a risky world. So, been a pleasure to speak to you here today. And Trevor and Jessica, thanks so much for making the time to join Cannabis Unfiltered with me.
Cheers, Nic. Thanks again.
You guys have a great
you.
afternoon, and please reach out to Trevor and Jessica if you've got any questions. Signing off. Have a great day, everybody.